So first, Tania is the CEO and co-founder of TELUS, a startup in San Francisco, but currently she's also based in Boston, and it applies new technologies for healthcare, especially elderly care. Prior to founding TELUS, Tania worked at Google and Capital IQ in product and strategy roles. She also held research positions at the Harvard Medical School and MIT's McGovern Institute for Brain Research. She graduated from Stanford with her master's in engineering, where she was a DFJ entrepreneurial fellow. So I got to know Tania. So I have this paper on robots in nursing homes that I've worked on for years. It's finally in the revision stages, but Tania and TELUS reached out, and since then we've been in touch, talking about potential collaboration. COVID has been challenging, but especially in the nursing care industry. But we've maintained contact, and I thought this was a great opportunity for Tania to share how she's using new technologies to assist healthcare for the elderly, especially in Japan, and also the opportunities and what it's like to become an entrepreneur. So in terms of Q&A, since we're a small intimate group, feel free to raise your hands, and then I can call on you, and you can freely share your thoughts, ask questions, and then we'll just go from there. So Tania, I'll give the screen to you. Do you want me to share the screens, the slides? I mean.
Yeah, I think there was just one slide, so
yeah,
if you don't mind sharing that.
Sure, I'll do that.
And I don't, either way is fine. But hi everyone, it's really nice to meet you. My name is Tania Koch, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of TELUS. I have been working on TELUS for the last few years and was ultimately really inspired by my own personal problem, which was that I was this really technical person. I work at these tech companies, yet when I was trying to help my family with the care of my grandmother, I came up short with technology, and that experience kind of stuck with me. And so at Stanford, I really focused on, wanting to work on healthcare. And this personal, problem really turned into an idea that I had and carried through with my co-founder, Kevin. And really the goal of TELUS is to bring good technology to elder care. And we've essentially built a hardware device which can sense the health of a person in a room without any wearables or video cameras. And when people see our technology, they say it's like magic. It really is. What allows us to do the magic is really a technology that's been around for many years. It's called radar. But in the last few years, in particular, it's become much more miniaturized, much better at and more accurate, essentially. And so we've utilized this technology to really apply it to healthcare. And on the AI side, a lot of that has to do with we're getting tons of essentially waveform data, raw data, and we classify it in real time and we make sense of it. So we take this data from the sensor and we can understand things about a person like, their heart rate or their breathing rate, their sleep habits, their room usage. We are currently selling in Japan. So Japan is our first market. And that's pretty rare and unusual for a US-based company, especially Silicon Valley-based company. But I'm happy to talk a lot about why we've chosen Japan as the first market. And we've now grown the team to about 15 people. We're still growing. We're selling in really the facility side, but the goal is ultimately to bring our technology to the consumer. So that's the sort of, next few years goal. Yeah, and I'm in general really passionate about the care industry and healthcare, and happy to answer any questions about technology and starting a company. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction. So I actually added this slide here, so sort of
Thank you.
shows the product to give a sense what you guys are actually developing and how it works. But first, I think it would be helpful if you could sort of delve into a little bit more about the technology, how it actually works, like this device, and how it's different from other similar devices that are potentially in the market or in development, and how you mentioned there's a lot of data coming through, how that's all processed to actually get at these biometrics that can be helpful in the elderly care setting.
Yeah, so the base technology is radar, and the device itself, like you see it in that photo, but it's you can hold it in the size of your hand, so it's quite small. If you imagine setting it up, you put it, on the wall, and that's really all you need to do. We will understand the health of a person, right after you set it up. And essentially, if you think about radar and the technology, it's, a waveform that we are recording on our system and making sense of with our algorithms. So we're classifying real-time radar, raw radar waveform data and making sense of it. So how is that, like, the base technology, is really interesting, and why that's really important is because it allows us to understand the health of a person without any cameras or wearables. So cameras have actually evolved with computer vision. You can, depending on how close range it is, you can understand heart rate and breathing rate using a camera, for example. But you can also understand other things, like if a person has fallen in a room. But there are a lot of privacy issues with cameras. So for us in our company, even though computer vision has gotten so far and it's really not a nascent technology, it's pretty well developed, we didn't want to use cameras because from our point of view, it just takes away the dignity of a person. And I think what I'll say there is that a camera may be good for someone with a cognitive issue, like a later stage dementia or Alzheimer's, but really for somebody who's aware of what a camera is, it really is a non-starter. So radar is a technology that allowed us to essentially get the precision of what you could get from a camera, but without having to have something invade your privacy so much. And a wearable, on the other hand, is also really great, but it has to be worn on the body and they can be taken off. They have charging issues, and it's not as reliable for those reasons. So ultimately we didn't want a wearable either. And again, our base technology allows us to not have a wearable or not have any cameras.
That's actually a great topic, because in class we talk about computer vision quite a bit, and we had this discussion among our students that our homes or even our cars would be the last place where they would want to have computer vision in there. And you've sort of understood that perception and developed this technology. But in terms of what you can accomplish technologically versus radar versus computer vision or wearables, how much of a difference is there in terms of is machine learning, if you can use radar tracking technology, is it pretty much as good as the other types of technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that absolutely. We do a lot of accuracy testing. Of course, a camera is always going to be the best, but I'll caveat and say this, that there are camera devices out there used in facilities, in care, and there's this really big issue there, which is that they have motion sensed alerts. So oftentimes they're getting like 1,000 alerts and they don't know what to do with all of that information. So a camera is good if you really have real-time annotation of understanding what a person is doing at every single second in the room. And that would be highly invasive. And so that's not something that people are currently working on. Is it possible? I think it certainly is possible eventually. I can't comment too much on where the state of that is today with cameras, but what I can say is that we do a ton of accuracy testing of our device versus a camera. We do it versus for sleep, for example, the gold standard for measuring sleep is something called polysomnography, PSG. That's like an overnight sleep study and test. Usually people are asked to take those tests if a doctor thinks you have sleep apnea. And so we've done, for example, lots of testing against the gold standard. And so I think for an emerging technology, you're constantly trying to prove your accuracy. And, I think we're in a stage where we've really kind of proved that we're within 95% of, the gold standards. And the range is between 90 and 100% really between us and gold standards. And that's really okay. And the reason why that's okay is because, being perfectly exact, maybe that's what a camera can do, but it really takes away your privacy, right? But for health in general, what you're really trying to understand over long periods of time, which is what we do, longitudinal data, you're trying to understand the health trend of a person. And so being 99.9% accurate is maybe not always what matters, but understanding if there's a trend downward or a major trend upward or, plus 20%, minus 30%, those are the types of things you're really trying to understand. So that's really what we try to do with our data. And I'll also say this, that, having a really cool technology will only take you so far. What we sell is really not radar or our device. We sell a product, which is these reporting of these trends, these health trends that we see with certain elders, and they're used very much in the care of individuals in a facility.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I mean, I would definitely feel uncomfortable having a camera in the room, but a device like what you guys are creating, especially for in-home care, I think that's the way to go. I have a lot of questions I've prepared, but rather than me going through this, I want our students to, ask questions. So hopefully this was enough background. So let's just open up. So Gavin, go ahead.
Yeah, I know you said you were prepared to talk more about the decision to go into the Japanese market. As soon as you said that, I was really curious about it. So if you could just talk a little bit about that, that'd be awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the market that we're really focused on is the aging market. And actually, Yang, how much has Japan come up at all? Like your work in Japan or aging?
No, not really.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so for everyone here, like 30% of the Japanese population is over the age of 65, roughly 30%, which is much higher. It's double the proportion population in the United States, which is about 15%. So that population dynamic has really changed the culture. And I'll share with you, like, just to share a contrast between the United States and Japan. Most corporate companies in the United States, like if you meet with, like, I probably shouldn't say different companies, but, various companies will be really interested in marketing or creating products for Generation Z, basically. I think I'm like, don't even count. I'm a millennial. I don't matter anymore. It's all about Gen Z. In Japan, what I can share is, like, if you meet with the top companies, like every top company in Japan, corporate, they are in meeting rooms strategizing, like, about how they build products and services for the aging population. And that's just such a stark contrast. And that permeates throughout, like, that business culture comes also from not just, the population dynamics, but the government is investing a lot in trying to come up with different products and services and subsidies to subsidize technology to help with this problem. So in Japan, you have this really, really high proportion population over the age of 65. And with that, you have a government that's looking for solutions to help. And another thing that's going on and dynamic in Japan which is global, and you're actually seeing it everywhere. It's a labor shortage, but for a long time, it's been a caregiver shortage, and that's been an issue actually even before COVID and these other labor shortages. So it's even more exaggerated. And so, how do you make up for the lack of people to help with such aging populations? You really want to subsidize technology. So that's where we come in. So that's a pretty clear difference between the Japanese market and the US market. There are subsidies for technology and adopting technology like TELUS. So we are subsidized by the government to be used in facilities, and also for care insurance for individuals to purchase it for themselves for home care. In the US, that doesn't really exist. You have to be slotted into Medicaid or Medicare and be an FDA approved technology, which is takes a startup a really long time to get to FDA approval. So it's a much higher barrier to be sort of considered and adopted through these other ways through the government, essentially, which really helps with adoption. So that's a long way to answer, but yeah, that's really a big reason why we're in Japan.
So one thing I wanted to build on is you compare Japan versus the US. And the US, if you were to market your product, what will be the key hurdle to actually sell your product? Is it the FDA approval, or is it just other type of regulation, or is it just the marketing or just perception of using certain technologies?
Yeah, for us, the goal is to get into the home. And so a big hurdle for us when you're manufacturing things, so like another big news item thing that you listen to these days is like a chip shortage. So that's something we have to face when we're manufacturing. And so our cost of goods sold is higher now than we would like it to be, for example, which could be okay when we're selling to a facility, but when we sell to a consumer, your margins are much less. So that these things kind of factor in and matter. Also having the inventory to be able to supply a sort of high demand market. And so those are the things actually, Young, we're really focused on the manufacturing side to beef up. The US market is something that we really do want to enter, and we want to enter it from a more consumer perspective rather than facility, because there really aren't a lot of government subsidies for technology adoption like there are in Japan. And there's such a big market in the US for the people who are at home, essentially, and want to age in place.
That's right. Like with COVID, I think there's been more demand. People want to now age in place. And we've been talking about in healthcare to actually move healthcare into the home. So if you were to go about targeting the consumer market, would it still follow the same regulatory hurdles other than just the marketing side?
No, it wouldn't.
Okay.
So luckily, we don't have to go through FDA approval, kind of like a Fitbit, unless you have, like the Apple Watch went through FDA approval because the sensor inside of it is an EKG. And so that's just a medical device, and therefore it has to be through FDA approval.
Okay, that makes sense. So yeah, students, Angie, go ahead.
I'm just kind of curious. I know, like you said, that you guys use like radar technology, but how does that radar technology then like analyze who's in the room? Like if there's more than one person in the room, how do you know, I guess, like who's statistics kind of they're like reading? And then also in a sense, because it's just a device on the wall, is there like another device that you then like have to see all of your like your blood pressure and all that, like all the information that it's collecting? Where do you see that information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we focus on analyzing one person in the room right now. And in a facility, in most cases, it is one person usually in the room, and the caregiver nurse is in at certain times. So we have a better understanding of their schedules, and so we don't necessarily need to do this algorithmically to understand who the elder is versus the caregiver. However, what I can say is, based on the movement of the person, we can pretty much understand the caregiver versus the elder because of how quickly one is moving. And we are currently working in our next version of understanding two people in a room, because that is something that will be really important for us moving into the consumer market, because of course it's not always one person at home. Sometimes it's a couple aging in place. So that's a really good question. In terms of integrating with other health markers like blood pressure, you mentioned, temperature comes up. So each facility, and I'll say this, unfortunately, there is no like standard protocol for collecting all of this health data, and so each facility will do it their own way. And we don't do blood pressure. It's something that is being worked on, is to do it algorithmically and non-contact, but blood pressure is a biomarker. Like, you really need it to have contact to understand the blood pressure. Temperature could be used you could do it non-contact, but you need an infrared sensor, and that's typically a camera. Or of course you could use other tools, but those are not integrated into our system. It's something though that's very interesting, and we do want to integrate with more health information. Right now, some of the information we get from the facility is the sort of health status of the individual. If they have Parkinson's disease, for example, Alzheimer's, some medications they're taking. And from there, we can kind of understand what health issues we should pay attention to more as well.
So it seems like there's this trade-off between privacy and then the amount of information that can be collected. And we go back and forth in class, discussing ethical issues related to AI. But what is your sense in terms of people's perception on, are they more willing to provide information or in terms of sacrifice privacy for better service? Or are they really concerned about privacy issues, and that's the main reason that they would actually prefer a device like this over just a camera? And where do you see people's demand, or how does that differ across, say, I don't know, maybe not demographics, or maybe organizations, etc.?
Yeah, so for camera, I mentioned this, but I think the cameras ultimately, when used for care and in this part of healthcare, which is, aging and care, I think they can be used. And there are some companies that do get information, and it's really focused on people and populations that have cognitive decline. So, Alzheimer's, very late stage dementia, this type of thing, where truly the awareness of a camera, I think it's kind of a philosophical question. If you're aware of a camera, then that's when I kind of like to say that's probably not okay. And if you're not aware of it, then okay, well, maybe that's not okay either. It depends. But if you have severe cognitive decline and can't care for yourself, then maybe in that scenario, that's okay. So privacy is something that I will say comes up really often when we are selling. That's a major perk of what we do, is that, we're lots of privacy by not having a camera, but getting all of this important information. And in terms of, I think a difference between a facility in general and when people are not in a facility is I've noticed that, in a facility, most people do, in a way, they do give up a small part of their privacy by being a part of the facility, and I shouldn't say privacy, but independence, and so I think that's a piece of it. So their health is no longer being 100% managed by them, right? And so that's one piece that's a little different, and that's why I think cameras are still sold in facilities, but occasionally sold. But I think for the consumer market, that's we just got an investment from the AARP, which, like, for what I do, it's like, they're like the OG of what we do. They're awesome. And they, we did a lot of tests and interviews in the US with consumers, elderly consumers, and, cameras are just a hard no for most people.
Well, yeah, congratulations on that funding. And yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
so yeah, it would be great if the product actually enters the US consumer market. It's such a huge market, and US is aging rapidly as well.
Yes.
So I was going to shift topics to entrepreneurship, but first I wanted to see if we have any other questions. Yes, Nicoletta.
This is just fascinating. I wanted to ask if you can elaborate more on the process of coming up with the idea of the technology itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, for me and my co-founder, Kevin, I will say that we had met in like the first class we took in grad school, and we just became good friends because we were like the two people in our class who really wanted to work on healthcare. So we had that in common. Our backgrounds were really complementary. He's an electrical engineer. My background is more stats. And then my work experience was back-end engineering and product and strategy. So really, really complementary. And we knew we wanted to work on hardware, technology, and healthcare. And so we would meet every month and just kind of shuffle through different ideas, talk about different problems in healthcare. And we really specifically had one conversation where we talked about our grandparents and this issue where we both had, difficulty finding good technology to care. And we were both I am like tech support for my family. Kevin is the same. And so we kind of were both shocked that we couldn't find great technology. And that was the kind of, what started this whole like brainstorm around, well, how could we do it better? And what are the innovations in technology? And, at that time, certainly computer vision was getting there, and but that was such a clear no from the beginning, that videos would not be something we do.
So this is actually great. This is a great foray into the topic of entrepreneurship. But with that idea, like, okay, there's a common goal and idea, a potential product. How do you actually move from that idea to actually creating a product, creating a company, and to becoming an entrepreneur? I mean, that's such a huge step. And maybe you can walk us through that process, what your thought processes were, what the actual processes were. That would be fascinating to hear. Totally.
So we got so excited. I mean, when we had this brainstorm, it's just like such a memorable time for myself because it was so exciting. We were like, it's that feeling when something just really clicks. And I think what clicked for me was that this was something I went through personally. I'd never, ever thought of it as like an idea or a business. But in that moment, it clicked with me that this could be so much bigger. Like many other people must have this problem. And this is a huge gap in the market. And I just fell in love with this solving this problem, basically. And so getting from there to actually starting a company, what Kevin and I did is we went to a bunch of elder homes, and care homes and facilities. From Stanford, there's a road called El Camino Real. And we basically just drove, and I just met with a bunch of facility directors and started asking them about their problems. I started meeting with families to ask them about their problems, and started to really form a hypothesis of what the problem is and what our solution could be. When we nailed down, how we wanted to solve the problem, which was build this hardware. Luckily, Kevin and I both had a mix of engineering background to kind of put together a prototype. And we did this actually without any funding. We just kind of did it on our own. And I think it was important to do that because what we were doing was really novel. And so we wanted to prove it to ourselves, does this actually work before we go and raise money? It was a really fun, I would call it just you're so excited, you just want to get going and move forward. And, there's all these legal documents. You realize oh, wow, I need to incorporate. I need to, think about the shares of our company. Eventually we're going to raise money. And so when you raise money, you need an entity to, assign that capital to, and do all of these other processes. But in the beginning, it was all about validating, can this work? And is this a good problem? Another thing I'll mention is we ran a Facebook advertisement, I just wanted to see it. We put $300 into a Facebook ad to just see, and we made his, Kevin's younger brother was a student at Berkeley and a film student. So he had access to film equipment. We made a video ad and just put it on Facebook. And the reception was so good, and the click-through rate and all these things were so good. We just thought, okay, let's pause that and just get going. That was the genesis. Yep.
Wow. So you created a prototype so that could actually somewhat using radar technology to do what you intended to do, and then put an ad on it. So from that stage, how do you get to financing and funding?
Yes. So this is a really good, remember this, everyone. The guest speakers who speak in your class, stay in touch with them, because you never know. You never know. And this is a scenario where I was a TA of a entrepreneurial finance class. And one of the guest speakers was this guy who, at the time, he was a partner at a venture capital fund. And he just gave this really inspiring talk, and I was so excited. So I had his email, and when Kevin and I had just sort of incorporated TELUS, and we had done a trial POC with no funding. We just found a facility that would, test with us, and we got this data. And I really wanted to share it with a venture capitalist, informally. And I reached out to him, and we met, and very quickly that meeting went from I had no intention of fundraising from him at all. And that meeting went from hey, this is really cool. Does it actually work? He was really skeptical. Does this work? But after validating that, he was like, okay, here's the plan. I would like to give you money, and here's how much. And, and that is kind of what spurred this through our seed round, essentially. So he did the pre-seed. So he was our first investor. His name is Phil Libin, and he was the founder of Evernote, which is, I don't know for a lot of you if you know what it is, but it's a note-taking app from like 10 years ago. That was well known a long time ago. And now he's the founder of another big company, and he's a serial entrepreneur, but he's been an advisor to me, an advisor to our company, a mentor, investor. Like we really hit the jackpot, and that really ultimately came from just relationship building and a genuine connection, like somebody I genuinely thought was awesome, who spoke in a class. So yeah, that's how it started.
That's a fascinating story. And to the students in this class, the more, yes, definitely keep Tania in mind. Never know.
Yeah.
Where
Doesn't have to be
telephones-
me. I may not be that interesting, so it doesn't have to be me, but someone else maybe.
In terms of the market potential, it's just an enormous market. So I mean, yeah, especially with privacy into consideration, I think Tania, I think, is someone you should be aware of. But before asking questions, I just wanted to double check, see anyone else have any questions at this point? Okay. One thing I wanted to discuss was COVID-19. It's such a big issue. It's affected all our lives. I feel like COVID could have been very detrimental to your business, given that how much nursing homes were affected here in the US. We all know about that, and also in Japan. But there's also the flip side that COVID-19 maybe have increased awareness of these type of technologies, that, okay, in-person care has limitations. There are a shortage of workers here in the States. There were a lot of nursing homes that try to hire workers, but nurses, caregivers weren't willing to work. And there's been discussions about, okay, increasing AI and technology adoption in healthcare. So it seems like there's potentially two forces working at the same time. And I just wanted to hear how that affected your business, your strategies, and ultimately how you navigated through COVID-19.
Yeah, so COVID-19 ultimately affected, we were in person, now we were not in person. I was in the middle of fundraising and then the stock market crashed. That was really unfortunate. Luckily, we were able to close a Series A, so we raised $7 million and it's funny to say this now, it's like, oh, whatever, you raised money through COVID, no big deal. But that was like, I was about to close around March 2020, and then it paused. And I was able to close it in August 2020, but that was a pretty hectic time in the world in general. So that was, definitely a big part of our story is being a company that could fundraise through the pandemic, and really in the beginning of the pandemic when there was a lot more uncertainty. A big issue that's ongoing that affects our company and affects a lot of companies is the chip shortage. And for anyone manufacturing something, this is a big deal. And to describe the chip shortage, and tell me if this is too off base, if I'm going in the wrong direction, but no, this is fine. Definitely, this essentially what has happened in this chip shortage is a lot of companies, big companies, have got worried about supply. And what they did is with their immense amount of hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars of capital, took key components and bought them all, and are essentially have them in a warehouse. And that's great because we know that, certain companies now can deliver on, different cars or whatever because they have a stockpile of chips. But for smaller companies, that's a problem. And it's a problem because you go through an iteration of validating a chip design. So we design a chip, We do a printed circuit board, we print that, and we have to validate that it works. And in what's happened to a lot of hardware companies is when you go through this validation process, by the time you validate that a chip works, it's out of stock. And so you have to try a new chip, go again, and that takes a lot of time. And so that's essentially what we're seeing with the chip shortage. I'm actually, a lot of people have been asking about that, so I'm going to write a piece about it. And so I can try to do my best to explain what it means to small companies and hardware companies, but it means that prices of chips are going up, things are more scarce, and it's really not, unfortunately, it's not solved. So it's still ongoing, and with other geopolitical things going on in the world, like it's going to probably impact it even more. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's in ways that you wouldn't even guess, but it's ongoing, and that's a super challenge.
I see. So basically, in terms of baseline price, cost has increased because of this, and potentially that's could affect some marketing. Is that come a concrete issue in terms of deploying your products?
Yeah, so it has more to do with building up our inventory. So we have demand, and it's, how do we fulfill the demand essentially and get it? And so what I'll say is some really interesting things are happening. Companies are bringing manufacturing closer to themselves. So in our case, we're very likely to find a manufacturer in Japan. We are, as we go to, expand in the US, we'll very likely find a manufacturer in the United States. Smaller companies, instead of relying on an assembly line in, let's say, Taiwan or China, are just building their own assembly lines, essentially, like in their office. And you can do that if you source and you can get your printed circuit boards ready, your plastics ready. You can build your own assembly line, believe it or not. And so people are being creative, and I think it's ultimately going to be a net positive. I think it's a good thing. I think it would be really exciting if manufacturing could come back to the United States, or to more local, country. Like Japan used to be a super manufacturing country, and so that would also be exciting. But yeah, I think you'll see that kind of shift, and how it affects us right now is inventory.
I see. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So anyone at this point, any hands? Okay. So in terms of, so one thing we focus on is, we talked about the ethical issue related to the data and privacy issues related to this. But in terms of just governance and regulation, what has been, in terms of any challenges, or you think that either in Japan or in the US or comparatively, that were key hurdles? Or it could be the technology itself, it could be related to, say, if you want to develop solve these supply chain issues. Were there any specific regulatory issues that came up as you develop new technologies or deploy new products?
Yeah, so in Japan, they have a regulatory body. Their equivalent of the FDA is something called the PMDA. Mm-hmm. And when you're designing a product, I think especially in healthcare, if you make a diagnosis, usually it's a very broad way to think about it. It doesn't always work, but if you're making a diagnosis, generally you need to consider, do I need some sort of approval in order to do this? And so I think that's a pretty important distinction between what would be in the realm of a health technology versus, kind of the example I gave of the Fitbit versus an Apple Watch, because the Apple Watch is using an EKG, and that's essentially in using a medical device sensor, you have to be approved by the FDA. And similarly, that's the same case in Japan, for example. So in our case, what we do is we don't make any diagnoses, not yet. I think that on the AI side and the data piece, like over time, we will have a lot of data and we will have the ability to make certain diagnoses. But the weight of the diagnoses it's heavy. We need to be correct. And so we're not willing to, start to guess that somebody may have, a certain, or Parkinson's, for example. Parkinson's, we can see through different movements of how someone walks, we may be able to understand the disease progression or onset, for example. But we need to be right if we're saying this kind of thing. And so, over time, we're very likely to be right in making these types of diagnoses. And at that stage, we really want to go through the PMDA, or in the United States, FDA, because it will be really important if we can catch things early on. But to get there and to get the accuracy, like that has to be 99.9% accurate. We really don't want to be 95% accurate with that. So in Japan, we are not regulated through the PMDA. We don't really face that kind of regulation because we're treated as a health technology, not a medical device.
I see. So in that case, it's basically up to nursing homes whether they want to adopt a technology. Is it the same, say, if there's a robot that a nursing home wants to adopt? Would that be something similar, or would they actually have to go get certain type of regulatory approval to actually purchase? Or
so we're not regulated by the PMDA, but we are classified as a care robot in Japan. So it's called Kaigo robot. Okay. And there is a body that oversees all the different technologies, essentially, that help with care and aging. So we are in that group. And from that group, that's where a facility can choose a certain technology. You have to be on this list to be even considered to be subsidized by the government.
And there's no counterpart of that in the United States, like a specific? No. I see.
The counterpart would be a Part C Medicare, and from there you'd have to be FDA approved. As of today, you'd have to be FDA approved to be considered to be part of, a Part C Medicare plan.
I see. So that reminds me of, I was curious if you had the chance to speak with the nursing home operator in Providence, Rhode Island, and what they were thinking of. Yeah. I don't know if you can share some of that.
Yeah, I can, because I'm not going to share the name.
Okay, yeah.
But I can share, I guess, what's really interesting there. So in the US, what we found is the facilities, they essentially, it's complicated, but there's not the same driving force to adopt technology in the United States for the facilities as there is in Japan. And there are a lot of factors. A lot of that has to do with what I mentioned earlier about why Japan, but that aside, in the last year, and really 2 years with COVID and this labor shortage, the facilities are now, they cannot keep caregivers. They can barely hire nurses. There's such a big shortage. And so like he was basically telling me that he's someone who's a board member of a big facility in the United States. And he was saying, we essentially, we don't have enough staff. So this is so problematic. People don't even want to be in our, like elderly people or their families don't want to put their grandparents in our facility because, there's not enough staff. Like they see that. And so, but if we can have technology that can help, and maybe if we have technology that can help look after the elders, maybe more people will want to join our facility, like more caregivers or more nurses, because it's so burdensome. So unfortunately, a lot of facilities in the United States right now, because of all of these labor shortages, it's kind of like a chicken or the egg. Like if you're in a facility that's understaffed, it's hard to get a lot of people who want to join an understaffed facility because it's going to be so much harder. Your work
Right.
is going to be so much more.
Mhm.
So that's where it's interesting, you know, it's made me open up some conversations in the US with facilities.
Wow, that's great. Yeah. So the labor shortage issue is the bigger driving force here. And it's also
Yes.
related to the low pay of these caregivers, from what I can see.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. Anyone else? You guys are quite quiet. Okay, Julia.
Hi. So something that we talk about a lot in our class, with the adoption of new technology and especially AI is consumer hesitancy. And I was wondering if when pitching TELUS to anyone you've encountered any hesitancy and how you've combated that.
Yeah. So in our interviews that we conducted with the AARP, this is just, you know, market research interviews. Something that was really interesting is that, you know, if we were talking, I think you can't really like for TELUS to say, oh, well, our device is good for anyone over the age of 65. That's not really true because it has a lot more to do with the condition you're in. So we were interviewing a lot of, you know, people who were over the age of 65, right? Because that's how you get people for an interview, as you say, you know, which could I interview you? And they're basically like, we're like, oh, you know, well, I'm healthy, so I wouldn't need this device, you know, but I know somebody who might. So it's like, you know, I think that when marketing, especially with the aging population, there's a lot of psychology. You know, you don't want to market something that makes people won't buy something that makes them feel old either. And so we're really not marketing to the healthy 65-year-old or 75-year-old. We're marketing to somebody whose condition is changed and is in decline. And we're marketing to their family, essentially. And so that's the buyer. If we're the hesitancy, the consumer hesitancy I've seen is really in marketing to the elder, because there's so much psychology and dynamics there of, you know, how a technology like ours may make them feel.
That's an interesting point. Haven't thought of it that way, but so you have to be aware of that. They don't want to feel like they're actually aged, or especially. So let's see, Nicoletta.
I have another question. What would you say that is your long-term vision, guys? But also, what other trends do you see in the industry right now, potentially for the future of this technology and other technologies as well?
Yeah, so my vision is to get to the consumer. So to get into home care, it's global. I think it's not just Japan or the US. I think it's, you know, I see aging in place as a global problem. So I really want to figure out how we can have a truly global company. And I think the, you know, long-term vision is beyond that is, you know, we don't necessarily need to manufacture our own hardware, as radar chips are embedded into other things and objects, everyday objects. You know, I am thinking, you know, how could we just do the AI and the software side of that? So that's very, very long term and kind of like, you know, Blade Runner like. I think that a big area that I've been disappointed to see how little it's taken off, but I'm continuously hopeful for the future, is really like telemedicine, and especially helping you, especially for the aging population. But I think with COVID, more people have engaged with telemedicine, so we'll see how it goes. But I'm really hoping that takes off, because I think it could be transformative. And I kind of wonder if some combination of telemedicine, but when you really need care, could a doctor come to your house, you know, directly, for example? some combination of making it both accessible, but much more meaningful and personal when you actually receive care. So we'll see. But that's the kind of healthcare I would hope for in the world.
That's a fascinating vision. So in some sense, using telemedicine or these type of devices to increase access, especially for those who might not have good access to healthcare right now, but also provide quality care when needed, where the in-person care is needed.
Exactly.
Yeah, that seems like a great model. Since you mentioned, some thought I had is, it seems like a lot of our students were interested in IoT devices. That's become so prevalent nowadays. Do you foresee your technology or the idea of IoT and these type of non-intrusive healthcare tracking being somewhat fused or merged? Is that something viable, do you think? Or that's just very specifically different types of technologies?
Yeah, no, it certainly could be. I think a lot of people are trying to be data integrators to integrate a lot of technologies together.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I think one thing that's been preventing this from like truly taking over is probably the issue of privacy. And
Yeah.
so I think that for example, if Google said, hey, all you health companies, why don't you just integrate with Google, and we got it, and that could have some potential other privacy issues. It's possible that could happen in the future. We do work with Google on other things like creating radar standards and things like that, but I think that would be the biggest thing that could prevent an ultimate like unification of all of your data. Yeah. But I've seen more and more of these integrators come up. I think truly, I wonder if some new integrator is really going to be able to do it, or if it's going to be one of the existing large companies like a Google or an Amazon who's going to try and merge all of your health data together. And if people will allow that. That
sounds scary, giving away, especially to them, maybe, where they can use
that
data for other purposes. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. So one key theme I had, the final theme was actually, we have later in the class, we will talk about diversity. And there's diversity in different dimensions. But just curious about, in terms of the tech space, as a female entrepreneur, what has been the challenge here in the States? Well, fundraising, developing products, but also in a global market where also the gender norms could be different. So just the aspect of becoming a female entrepreneur, the challenges related to financing, marketing, any of these issues. Just wanted to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'll say this. My personal take is to not focus on the challenges, but to kind of work with what I've got and to take advantage of that as best I can. And so in my case, I feel really lucky to have strong mentors from Stanford who are professors, and even like Phil, our first investor. And because of these like quality connections in fundraising, I can't speak to a lot of like firsthand, accounts of what essentially, you're bringing up. But what I will say is, prior to starting a company, and especially, working at Google before I was at Stanford, I hadn't met a lot of female entrepreneurs or startup founders. And, but once I was in a community that didn't really focus on that, it just was focused on, quality work, and I saw a lot more of that diversity around. I didn't really think that much about it, and I think it normalized it a lot more. So being in that university setting, having really strong mentors, like one of my professors who's a mentor to me, Tina Seelig or Heidi Roizen, they were both founders of their own companies. And so everything becomes really normal. And so that's what I hope in what I'm doing. I can say that being our engineering team, we have a lot of women. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I think maybe that's because I'm a woman who's also been an engineer, and that's great. But it's a complicated topic. I think that, what I hope to do is really focus on what I can do, which is, kind of be the change, I guess. And, yeah.
Being the role model is the biggest force, I guess, right? Yeah. Yeah. That sounds awesome. Okay. Let's see. Do we have any other questions among our students? We won't have many chances to speak with someone like Tania. Okay. So I just wanted the last questions, couple or one or two questions, to be anything if you wanted to share other than that we've discussed here. Any experience, thoughts? It could be either related to the technology or the process of entrepreneurship, healthcare, the vision of the future. But yeah, just anything that you think would be helpful for students. Not everyone is thinking of becoming an entrepreneur, but everyone is interested in the technology, what it implies for the future. So yeah, any insight would be grateful.
Yeah, I guess my parting words are just work on something you love. And, I found that at Stanford and in San Francisco, everybody wants to start a company. And, I think it's a worthy thing to do if you have this, what I really think of as like founder market fit. It's like you have found something that you truly love and feel like you can throw yourself into, not just for 1 year, but 5-10 years. I think, and if not, then don't rush it. It will come to you. There's no, there's no timeline of like, you have to start a company by a certain age, or, I think a lot of people underestimate that a lot. And a lot of really great founders are, much older than myself. And I think that, you're always making progress. Like if you're working on something you love to do. And I would also say, like, a caveat is, if you are looking for a job after school, it's just, if you don't get something you necessarily love, like, that's okay. You'll get there eventually. Just focus on getting the skills you need to get you to the next place. And so I will say, before Google, I worked at a fintech company. I can say this confidently. I really don't care for financial technology. But for me, it was much more about learning about being an engineer on that team and then working into a product management role, getting those skills. And that's ultimately what brought me to Google. And at Google, I worked on launching products for small businesses, which again was not really my passion area, but I was able to learn about launching apps, running, the launch of different, this product on an Android and iOS app, how we were choosing different markets to launch to, all of that kind of comes back, and engineering practices and business practices that I was able to leverage and use later in life. So I can share that it took me a while. I wish I found TELUS earlier, but I'm also glad I had these experiences prior to it. So yeah, just do what you love.
Yeah. And just one research that recently came out in the American Economic Review is they actually found that the most successful founders found their first companies around 45 to 50 years old. And the perception that young entrepreneurs are the most successful is actually incorrect. So I take that to heart. And Tania, I mean, you have more opportunities. You can be a serial entrepreneur, but as you point out, just pursuing your dreams, that sounds great. So one last question. Is it okay to share your email to any students who might be interested in, if they want to reach out later? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for sharing your time and experience. This has been fascinating. I hope the students have found this enlightening as well. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.